Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm going to be very brief given the amount to discuss and the shortness of time. I'll begin by saying we've got a fantastic trio to discuss the future of the Republican Party and conservative politics in America, the last of our regional meetings virtually, and looking forward to seeing many of you in person tomorrow. Susan, who I know is working very hard on a book about Trump, is going to moderate our conversation. Susan Glasser, known to many of you, a prolific and really insightful writer for The New Yorker. And Susan, I'll hand it over to you to introduce our panelists and get our conversation going.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Megan, and thank you for having all of us today, and to everyone who's taking the time to tune in. I have to say, I was eager to moderate this conversation and to say yes, because I personally just want to hear the answer to the question posed here about the future of the Republican Party and what conservative politics looks like in the United States going forward. And I can't think of two better people to help us answer some of the questions surrounding that than former Congressman Will Hurd of Texas, who just left the House this year after a number of terms in office. He and I first met, I recall, soon after he came to Congress, sitting next to each other at a dinner, bonding over obscure Afghan warlord trivia. Because the thing about Congressman Hurd, unlike the vast majority of other members of Congress, is that he actually did something kind of real and interesting in his previous life, which was he was worked for the CIA and was an intelligence analyst, served in Afghanistan, and he knows an awful lot about the history of obscure Afghan warlords. So we can ask him about that, as well as questions about politics and where things are going and why he decided, at least temporarily, to step out of electoral politics. And joining us as well is Bill Kristol, who is the person that probably most of us look to try to explain the party in which he spent most of his life and has written and thought so eloquently about, including its current crisis in the last few years. Of course, there's not been anyone who has been more associated with the Never Trump movement, I guess it's called, and in its various incarnations. And so I'm just really delighted to be with both of them. I should say to everyone who has tuned in that we're looking forward to making this a very question and Q&A intensive centered session. So I'll just have a conversation with Bill and Will for the first few minutes, and then we'll look to bring you in. If you can, use your raise hand function to get questions in, but I'll recognize you. Try to keep yourself on mute before then, obviously, and we'll take it from there. But first of all, I just want to jump right in. Congressman, why did you leave Congress? And is that meant to tell us anything about the future of the Republican Party?
No, it's not meant to say anything, but the reason I left Congress is I don't think these jobs were designed to be in forever. And you don't have to die or be defeated to leave Congress. And so I thought I enjoyed talking about technology in a policy setting. And now I'm enjoying talking about policy in a technology setting. All my life, I have a simple goal just to try to be Jenny Rometty when I grew up. She's someone I look to as a leader. And so being able to be involved in technology there, because my fundamental belief is that we are in the United States and our allies are in a new Cold War with the Chinese Communist Party, with the Chinese government, and that the only way that we're going to be able to address what I consider generational defining challenges is if the public and the private sector starts working better together. Now, the nonsense in Washington, D.C. and the political system is getting gummed up in this process and is preventing us to address many of these issues and that we're going to deal with in this latter half of our century. But ultimately, for me, these jobs, get in, get out, get in, get out. I don't think this is something you're supposed to be in for 40 years.
Before I go to Bill, can I just follow up, Will? Just the other day, you had the former president saying essentially, well, the entire rationale of the Republican Party, as I see it going forward in the midterm elections and in 2024, has to be the question of the rigged election that was stolen from me and the legitimacy of the 2020 election. Do you think that he's right that that's
no? It's crazy. No, it's not. Like, look, I think the key though, the Republican Party needs to be a party that's actually based on values, right? And our actions have to reflect our values, and that hasn't been the case. And so, but here is part of the problem. I think so 2020 was the most secure election in the history of elections, period, full stop. And until we accept that the election was not stolen, it was lost. And it was lost big time, right? President Trump was incapable of expanding the brand of the Republican Party or himself to the largest growing groups of our voters, full stop, okay? But the two takeaways we should take from the 2020 election is, one, don't be a jerk, and two, don't be a socialist. And so unfortunately, what you're going to see is the Republicans are going to take the House back in 2022. That is almost a fait accompli. And part of it is because the current Democratic Party policies are so bad that some of these things are making Trump look like he was a smart guy, right? And so this issue is the authoritarian wing of the Republican Party is going to exist beyond 2022. But ultimately, in 2024, if this trajectory continues, you're going to see a Republican candidate do what's happened 8 of the last 9 times or 7 of the last 8 times and lose a national election, right? And so we have to move beyond that. And of course, there are people that are not, because they're running a campaign of the last election. The opportunity that Republicans have in order to appeal to moderates in the middle and conservative Democrats to win elections in landslide manner, we're missing out on that opportunity because we're focused on this notion that the 2020 election was not the most secure election in the country. Oh, and by the way, it was the failures of dealing with COVID at the time. When you look at some of the voters in 2020, COVID was their number one issue. If Republicans would have taken it a little bit more seriously up there, we would maybe have seen something a little bit different.
So, Bill, I want to bring you in on this. Do you agree with the congressman that this is, in effect, a losing proposition if still the one that the huge bulk of elected federal Republicans are embracing? I mean, what do you make of the current crop of elected officials, this very present company excluded clearly, but what do you make of the current crop of elected Republican officials deciding that they can't abandon Trump regardless of January 6th?
And I wish I were confident. First of all, it's good to be with everyone here, and with Will and Susan and Megan and Richard and all old friends. I wish I were confident it were a losing proposition, but I don't think the evidence is there for that. The Republicans picked up seats in the House in 2020. They barely lost the Senate, really on a kind of fluky election in Georgia, you might say. Trump probably hurt their chances there, but it's not clear that Trump has hurt the party. Trump ran in 2016 and 2020. We have a lot of empirical data on this. Trump did not do worse than McCain, whom I loved, and Romney, whom I respected, in 2008 and 2012. That's just a fact. So people can say, and I wish it were the case, that the Trump hand is a losing hand. I don't think it's quite as obvious. It's not obvious in the party, and it's not even obvious, unfortunately, quite as obvious in the country. I mean, I would say a couple of things. However, and one thing we've all learned in the last few years is we shouldn't be too confident in our predictions. The trends don't continue, they break, they change, they're inflection points. So I didn't think Trump would be the nominee when he came down the elevator in 2015. I thought he had a chance to beat Clinton, but I didn't think he would. No one thought Biden would be the nominee, particularly in 2017, I would say. And we'll see. I think it's very open. And I don't think 2022 is nearly as baked in as most people do. We'll see how Biden does if we turn the corner on COVID. Will may think he doesn't like the big spending stuff, but it's not clear it's going to be that negative, honestly, in the short term. I don't know if it'll be negative at all, actually, and they won't get all of it. And, I very much disapprove of Afghanistan, but we'll see where that looks like 6 or 9 months from now. So I think the whole future is much more open in both parties and between the parties than we tend to say. Having said that, we do have 6 years now of experience, right? 6.5 years of Trump as the leader of the Republic. Well, 6 years since he announced, 5 years as leader of the party. And every time people like me thought, oh my God, finally there'll be a rebellion. Finally, all those people who privately tell me they know better are going to step up. A few did, Will did, others did. But at the end of the day, he became more dominant over his 4 years as president, not less. There was no serious challenge to him in 2020. A couple of decent people tried, but it wasn't there. The party was with him. January 6th happened, he lost. That was supposed to frick the bubble a little bit. His big thing was he won. McCain and Bush and Romney lost. So you had to be with Trump. He lost cleanly. Everyone said on November 4th, okay, finally, we can move on and get beyond Trump. January 6th happened and everyone said, oh, really now we can move on because this is so disgraceful and terrible. But at the end of the day, we haven't moved on. And Trump is very strong and Trumpism is very strong. And it's not just a bunch of has-beens and people who are not in touch. I wish it were with the rising electorate. Tell that to the Republican Senate candidates in Ohio and Pennsylvania and North Carolina and Republican House candidates. Maybe they're going to lose. Maybe they're making a terrible miscalculation, but they don't think so. And no one's standing up to them, And who's running on the other side, incidentally? A lot of people are enjoying the private sector. And I don't say this critically, people have to live their lives, but I don't see a lot of non-Trump Republicans saying this is the moment to save the party, because I think it's very hard to save in the short term, which is why I myself don't think, I'm doubtful about the saving of the Republican Party strategy. And I'm more interested in helping the sensible wing of the Democratic Party strategy.
Yeah, I want to
Susan, let me. Can I refine an answer based on what Bill has said? So the percentage of the current Republican electorate that is supportive of Trump, that's fixed, right? It's like depending on what day of the week, it's 35 to 42%. I'm not questioning that. Just like in the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders has a solid 30%, right? And so politicians are lazy. And they're going to do the easiest thing possible. And the easiest thing possible right now is to appeal to that percentage of the primary electorate. Let's take the House, for example. 92 seats of the House, 92% of the seats in the House of Representatives, 92% of 435 are decided in the primary. And in the last non-presidential election in 2018, the average number of primary voters in a contested primary was 54,000 people. So that means 26,501 people are deciding 92%, and they're the most extreme, whether that's in the Republican primary or the Democratic primary. So that's who everybody's talking to. These aren't national elections. People are talking to a very small subset of people. However, and guess what? That's the easiest way to win. I'm not questioning that. But there's an opportunity that with a little bit of hard work and some dough, that you can bring in a different set of voters, right? And so this notion that you're going to change people's opinions about Donald Trump, that's wrong. And look, I wish more people were trying to figure out why do people believe that way, not just what they believe. Why do they believe that? Because we have seen some examples that Trump's endorsement on down ballot races is not as big of a deal as everybody thought. There was that special election here in Texas where the person that Trump endorsed lost, and then in a runoff, and then in Ohio, even though the person that Trump endorsed won, if that had gone to a runoff, that had been a normal election, the other individual would have won by a mile in that runoff. And so, yeah, like I believe we got to have two strong parties that have a competition of ideas. And the major trajectory of where things are going based on the elected officials who are lazy and going to do the easiest thing, and that's talk to what political consultants say are likely Republican primary voters, that's all that they're going to focus on. So there's an opportunity with the kind of work and attention and focus in order to make sure there's some of those candidates that actually believe in those principles that many of us think of, whether you're Republican or not, of where the Republican Party it should be.
I would just slightly correct. I mean, Trump won the presidential nomination of his party twice. Sanders never won the presidential nomination of his party. Trump was president for 4 years and had the total loyalty of his party, including of people who originally weren't favorable to him. And they all ended up voting against impeachment the first time and the huge majority against impeachment the second time. And 60% of the House Republicans for overturning the election results on January 6th after the Capitol had been storm. So I don't think it's Bernie Sanders doesn't have all those votes support in the Democratic Party. Joe Biden's president. And in the Democratic primaries, I totally agree with you on the opportunity. And I wish more people were stepping up and taking it. And I think there's a chance, incidentally, as I said, nothing is forecast. Trump could wane some. We could have less Trumpy Republicans, though not anti-Trump Republicans, win in more primaries in 2022. It would be nice if more people were stepping up to do that. I don't see much of that, honestly. And I take it, therefore, that the political market is somewhat efficient, and people are looking at that and thinking, I can't win. Now, as you say, more extreme voters tend to dominate primaries. But the truth is Joe Biden won the Democratic primary. And the truth is, in the Democratic primaries in 2021, more moderate candidates have won than more left-wing candidates. Would I bet a huge amount on moderates dominating the Democratic Party for the next 5 or 10 or 20 years? No, it's very dicey, I think. But at least they're fighting. And Terry McAuliffe is the nominee here in Virginia and may or may not win. We'll see what happens in other places. So I hope Will's right, that there's more beneath the surface in the Republican Party of non-Trumpism. But I would say if there is, I mean, in your state of Texas, Greg Abbott is going to be contested from the right.
Sure, yeah. But that's what people don't realize. Greg Abbott is the moderate in the primary.
All right, well, Will, I want to ask you about Texas. Okay, so you were a Texas congressman. The rest of us are not in Texas. Explain to us, as you said, Greg Abbott is not the most, right-wing candidate. That seems hard to believe. How is it possible that we can have, along with Florida, one of the biggest 3 states in this country, pursuing the course that it's been pursuing on COVID, on a whole host of issues that seem to be departing from any sense of shared reality as probably the rest of the people on this call who aren't from Texas understand it. Help us to explain this, because it doesn't seem explainable, actually. But yeah, I take your point about gerrymandering.
I think, look, and this is what, what Bill just said, right, about the trends where things are going, that's happening here in Texas, right? Like there's no question about this. And so what I try to focus on is where that opportunity to change this is, right? And so again, you take 2020 in Texas. Most prognosticators thought that Democrats were going to take the state house here in Texas. And ultimately, Republicans in the state house have an 11 member majority. And when you add up all those votes, it's something crazy, it's like a total of 10,000 votes that were the difference in that handful of places. However, the primaries are the ones that are dominating many of these conversations, and people are worried about a primary electorate because they're going to talk to the same people that have generally come out, right? And so look, I think some of the things, right, like I want to be careful how I say this. Look, we should be increasing the number of people that are voting, not decreasing, right? If you're afraid of an increase in electorate, then maybe you need to rethink your principles and theories and strategies and the things that you're talking about, right? We should be increasing access to this. I actually believe in local control. If you don't think a president should be able to tell a state what to do, then the state shouldn't be able to tell what the cities, the counties, and school districts should be able to do. Right. And they should have the flexibility, because what you need in Loving County, 95 people in the entire county, versus Bexar County, where San Antonio is, one of the top 3 largest counties in Texas. Right. You have different needs. Right. And so ultimately, it's this notion of running to some of these, what I would consider red meat issues. Right. And I would say that the fundamental problem is the same problem in Texas as it is in California. One party rule, right? We need to have a robust conversation and a back and forth and a competition of ideas. Now, that's me if I had a magic wand and wanting a perfect scenario. It's going to be tough to get to, but again, I think those trends Bill was talking about, you're seeing those happen in states like Texas.
So Bill, I want to ask you, we're going to open it up to questions, and I see Jane has her hand up there. Other people, go ahead and get your questions ready. But right before we do that, Bill, I want to ask you just a little bit more big picture. Is the Republican Party even a conservative party anymore? I mean, what does it mean? It seems like ideology, as well as kind of, the tactical approach to the problem that Will talked about, is really still up in the air right now, that Trump has essentially transformed what we thought was the Republican Party's ideology. And Will referred to it as the, authoritarian wing of the Republican Party. But I'm just curious, as someone who's thought, a lot about, what it means to have a two-party system in the country. What is the Republican Party right now? And, will that remain fixed, do you think, over time?
And I think if one looked at it from afar, from abroad, or from 30,000 feet or something, and sort of got some of the history out of one's mind and some of the presuppositions that it can't be happening here, you would say it's a pretty authoritarian leading party with a fair number of remnants of older fashioned conservatism, and with aspects of it, even among younger people, which doesn't give up hope. I mean, it's not that the party is, 100% that way, but we're just seeing an awful lot in real time here about the accommodation of the election, of the big lie about the election, the accommodation of really kooky anti-vax vaccination conspiracy theories, of increasing extremism and denouncing one's opponents in a kind of not just demagogic, but really calling people traitors and so forth. And not much pushback, I'd say, from the mainstream types who one assumes don't believe that. And one knows in a way they don't believe it because they tell you privately, but who are not pushing back. And I mean, so what January 6th happened? What's happened since in the actual real party out there? Have candidates emerged who are sort of critical of Trump's behavior between November 3rd and January 6th, with everything he tried to do at the state level and at the federal level? Some. They're not doing very well. My Fred Raffensperger in Georgia, who stood up to Trump, Liz Cheney, deposed from the House Republican leadership in a very tough race in Wyoming, where she was totally safe before. So all the momentum is not in favor of, if you want to put it this way, conservatism. It's in favor, unfortunately for now, of authoritarianism. I don't think it's lost. I don't think it's what can give up. Things could change. Certainly, maybe they're not likely to change much by 2022 or 2024, but they could certainly change after that. And it's very important for the country. I totally agree with Will that we have two sensible parties committed to the rule of law and to democracy. But honestly, we have, in Virginia, where I live, there's a Republican who one assumes doesn't believe all the craziness, but is utterly unwilling to denounce it. And here, I have a difference with some of my friends who are still hopeful for the Republican Party, that I don't think one can just get through this by waiting it out. I think it has to be confronted. And I don't see much stomach for confronting the authoritarianism in the party now. So I think there's an authoritarian wing, which is a big wing. There's a accommodating or acquiescing to authoritarianism in many ways wing, which is a big wing, and there's a small anti-authoritarian wing.
Will, are you glad when you look at what's happened to Liz Cheney in the last few months that you're not in Congress anymore? Is that, do you?
Look, I'm not glad, right? Like my thing is, look, I followed a simple principle when I was in Congress. Agree when you agree, disagree when you disagree, right? And so, all the things that I would have said when I was in Congress, I've said now. And I just want to add on to something that Bill said, right? Like all these trends he's talking about, I agreed with, right? But the resources that are needed for the smaller group of folks that may want to try to rebuild the party are not there, because those folks are saying it's not worth it. We can't pull it off, right? And so there is the folks that could be there to deal with this. It's not just candidates that are not stepping up. It's the people that have the resources to help the candidates are also not stepping up in order to have this ultimate fight. And here's what I learned in Congress. Members of Congress, and Jane, tell me I'm wrong. Nobody wants to be first. Nobody wants to be second. But everybody's going to they're going to fight each other to be third and fourth, right? And if you're able to change the way people win and show that it's successful, then that's where I think this trend starts getting thrown back. And again, I don't know if that's going to necessarily be a huge effort in 22. I think 24 will see more, and then after.
So Jane, that's a good note for you to jump in on as our first question.
Well, hi, Will. There is life after Congress. I can vouch for it. And Bill, I love what you've been doing lately. I also love you, Bill. I'll confess on air. But, you know, I'm another one of these people who bailed, Will. I didn't lose. In the middle of my 9th term, imagine that for an insane number of years in Congress, 420 to be exact. I walked out to head the Wilson Center, an oasis of bipartisanship, and it really was, and did that for a decade. And I thought it was a great gig, and sadly had many of the elements missing in Congress. So I just want to put a couple things out there and see what you both think. And hi, Susan. You know, get your book done. It better be brilliant, like your last book. Just saying, no pressure. But so here's what I would say. That we don't only have toxic partisanship, which we definitely have. We have toxic tribalism in each party. And that makes each party almost dysfunctional as a party. The Democrats have it too, not just the Republicans. I want to know if you agree with me about that. Second point is we have sadly through social media and nationalized our big elections like Virginia. Virginia is no longer Terry McAuliffe against Glenn Youngkin. It's a referendum on Joe Biden. And that makes it harder for Terry, whatever his message is, and I like him. I think he was a pretty good governor, to be heard because the conversation's about Biden. And anyway, I just wonder what you think of that. And the third thing is that many people that we both respect, and John McCain was certainly one that I respected too, Fred Malik, who chaired the Wilson Center for a period and was a dear friend who also, he raised money for Republican governors, and he also supported a few Democrats like me, used to rail against candidates putting party over country. And I think, sadly, that's where we are. I mean, where is the candidate who says country first? I actually would put Liz Cheney close to that, and was very impressed with what she did. And I agree that she traded probably, I don't know how easy a race would have been for a huge, ugly, awful race. And if I were in Wyoming, I'd vote for her. I just would. I just think it's tragic for your party, or not your party, Bill, Will's party. So my final comment is just that I think Bill is right. I mean, if I weren't an optimist, why would I have stayed in politics this long? But that there is a chance to save us. And the chance comes in the center where all of us are, at least the three of us are for sure. And how to jumpstart that is what's hard. Given the fact that 90% of the primaries decide the races. But California, I'm so glad I don't live in Texas. Well, California does now have citizen commissions drawing the lines for Congress and the state legislature. And it has so-called jungle primaries where everybody runs against everybody. And the top 2 vote getters, if nobody gets to over 50%, have a runoff, and they could be in the same party. And so I think these are steps that other states could take. I think yours will never take it, Will. I'm sorry for you, but I think many states will. And the final comment is to Megan. I think the last 2 sessions this week, the one on Canada and the one on Mexico, were terrific. And I really love the way you have showcased and the enormous talent in the Trilateral Commission, not just in the United States.
Thanks, Jane. Bill, you want to get started there?
You go ahead, Will, if you want. I mean, you're a fellow member of Congress. Go next,
Sure. Jane, it's always good to see you. I've loved working with you when you were at Wilson Center. Let's take that last point first. New maps for the Texas House just came out 2 nights ago, right? And let's be honest, in most states, it's about incumbent protection. This is, and those maps, the Democrats had much input into those maps as Republican did. They just, because they don't have to vote for it, they get to take shots at it, even though privately they're the ones that made their districts even, the red districts got redder, the bluer districts got bluer, right? Because it's all about incumbent protection. And look, for me, if I had the magic wand for me on how you would fix all this problem is make every district as close and House seats and lower level as close to 50-50 as you can make. No more than +6 in one direction. I think a race that's +6 in either direction is a jump ball, and anybody can win that. I think that's an organizing principle that I would advocate to have a competition in November. And I believe that because that's why I won. If every Republican voted for me when I was in Congress, I would still lose. I had to get independents. I had to get Democrats. And so I was rewarded. The incentive structure was there. Now, I would hope to think that, I would do it anyways, but the incentive structure was there in order for me to win. And to your point about toxic tribalism is accurate, right? It's extremism, right? And the problem is extremism on either end, and that the one of the symptoms of extremism is theater. And this political theater that everybody's focused on. But guess what? We can also walk away from it, right? We don't have to participate and deal with that theater. So don't get me wrong. I think where things are going, it's scary because this broader issue, the U.S. economic and military dominance is no longer guaranteed. We are in this new Cold War. And I want the American economy to be the most important economy because that's good for all of our 401ks. That's good for the jobs our kids and grandkids are trying to get. And we are going to lose this battle if we don't sort out this other issue. I think General Mattis said in 2013, a functional political system is more important than like 20 battleships, right? And so this is why this issue matters, because we have to address some of these issues. And look, we haven't even talked about technology. The technological change we're going to see in the next 30 years is going to make the technological explosion of the last 30 years look insignificant. And how is that going to impact and remake society? If we couldn't even handle a simple algorithm like, sharing the things that, things showing you what you like to see on a social media platform, what's going to happen when we have artificial general intelligence, right? And so these are those generational defining challenges I think we have to deal with. And we have to get this issue of getting toxic politics. And guess what? It starts with us, right? Everybody, do you share something? And most people on this call probably share something from an opposing side. But are we contributing to the toxicness? Are we contributing to saying something slightly crazy because it drives clicks on social media? If we start with ourselves, maybe we can do a little bit better. Anyway, sorry to get excited, Susan and Bill.
You're muted, Susan.
You're muted, Susan. You're muted.
Got it. Will, I was just saying that you've now got me terrified about politics in the AI era and what's the Republican Party going to be then. But Bill, do you want to say?
So just a word to also put in a broader context, but going back, there were long-term trends of partisanship accelerated or intensified by decisions like gerrymandering, but of course the Senate's not gerrymandered. And so I'll take that as an example. When I came to Washington in 1985, the majority of states had a senator from each party. I think 26 did. And then basically the others split more or less evenly. So what would the math be on that? 12 each would have 2 senators of each party. That would give you a 50-50-ish Senate. Now there are 6 states that have senators from each party, from both parties, and 44 states, 22 each. 22 have 2 Republican senators, Texas, 22 have 2 Democratic senators, California. And think of that for a second, though. So that's not the House. There's no gerrymandering. The state borders haven't changed. There's been socioeconomic sorting. That's a much more complicated thing, but it's a free country. People can live where they want and take jobs where they want. Businesses can, in America, move quite easily. So they set up where they want. And we have a situation where when I got to Washington, it was already fairly partisan in the mid-'80s with Reagan and stuff. More senators than not had a colleague from the other party. And now 6 do, and the others don't. And so that gives you just a flavor of the natural almost increase in partisanship. Because as I say, the boundaries of the Senate didn't change. And now the rules of Congress have contributed, the way parties work have contributed, the way primaries work have contributed, the way social media works has contributed. But I do think what happened around 6, 7, 8 years ago is we went from hyper-partisanship, which is bad, but not necessarily devastating to a system, to what the political scientists call affective polarization, which is a fancy way of saying the real polarization, what Jane calls tribalism is a good way of putting it, but also the affective part is that the main thing that you want is the main thing driving you is you hate the other side. It's not, I mean, there are activists on different issues who are a little fanatical, we could say, or let's just say committed, and that leads to a certain type of partisanship and polarization. But now it's just hatred. And I say just hatred, but of course we know what happens in political systems where hatreds become dominant. And in America, we've had plenty of hatreds over our history, and some of them have been horrible and have had terrible effects. But most of them have been sort of kept in check or have been reduced over time, or others have stood up against them, and pluralism, the Madisonian system sort of diffused them, I think. That was the intention at the beginning of the founders, and it worked out okay. But now we have a situation where we have a nationalizing of affective polarization. It's not exactly by states. Final point, I'll just make this quickly. People, red states, blue states, sometimes I'm sure people from abroad see that and they think it's less, Will knows this very, very well, it's less that than red areas and blue areas. I mean, you know, the Austin and Houston and Dallas look more like, in many ways, cities in blue states, so to speak, and parts of Pennsylvania, slightly blue state now, parts of Virginia here, which has gone blue and is more democratic. But if you go to Southwest Virginia, it's very, very different from here in Northern Virginia where I am. So the country has been polarized, not in a American Civil War sort of way quite, where the regions are different, but in a more, I don't know, the Balkans maybe way, where you've got pockets of each. But the pockets, unfortunately, you'd think the dispersion would create a kind of understanding, right? If you're in Austin, you're only 25 miles away from extremely red areas of Texas. So that's just, and of course, on the day-to-day level, there's much more, thank God, still understanding and community, and people play in the Little League and they don't agree with each other and so forth. But the degree to which we now have the sort of unleashing of the hatreds, even at the local level, look at the school boards, kind of classic American institution that was supposed to bring people together and work out things locally. Now it's having the opposite effect. So, and this is what scares me the most. I mean, in addition to AI, artificial intelligence, and so forth, I mean, once you unleash these things, it's a little hard to just put them back. Once it becomes the norm to go to a school board meeting and not just differ with maybe the person from 2 miles away about exactly how the curriculum should be balanced, but accuse the person from 2 miles away of being anti-American, a traitor, and someone who needs to be crushed, as it were. And I do think it's a somewhat asymmetric polarization. The left has its problems and really does have problems in the universities, I think, and other places. But the right is the one seeking to bring government to bear here mostly on this and crush the enemies and denounce them as traitors. Once that gets unleashed, it sort of escapes. It's a Frankenstein situation. It's not clear that Trump could stand up tomorrow and tell people to calm down, and I'm not sure they would calm down. So that's a very worrisome situation.
All right, Joe Nye, hopefully you can help us make sense of this.
Well, generally speaking, people assume that politicians have an incentive to move to the center to capture a majority. And after the 2012 election, there was a Republican strategy autopsy, which said we've got to move to the center to capture a majority. But in fact, what we've seen is that's worked in New England, where we have 3 Republican governments and governors who are capturing Democratic votes in New Hampshire, in Massachusetts, and Vermont. But it's not working in the rest of the country. Maryland, it has worked. But in general, it's an oddity that the Republican strategy has turned out not to be majoritarian, but what Ezra Klein calls minoritarian. And because they look at the strategy or the structure of urban-rural and realize that you can keep winning offices by appealing to a minority. You don't need a majority. And the question, of course, is if you pursue that long enough, you're going to delegitimize the political system. And that goes back to the question I'd like to hear both of you say something about, which is how do you get out of that trap? In other words, if you have if a minoritarian strategy will work, how do you get out of a minoritarian strategy? And Jane mentioned open primaries as one possibility, so that people have an incentive to move to the middle in the primaries. What other things can be done to encourage the Republican Party to go back to what it had in 2012, which is a majoritarian strategy, rather than what it has now, a minoritarian strategy?
There's, I think, a lot of things ranging from election reform to social media regulations of a sensible kind to leadership. This is what Will has suggested or hinted at least, and I think is absolutely right. People need to stand up. And in these states, it's not, Ezra's it's a little bit too comforting to say it's minoritarian. Tons of people vote in these primaries at the state level in Ohio, are going to vote in Ohio. They're going to vote in Georgia. They're going to vote in Texas. And, and then they're going to have an election, which, leaving aside questions of election integrity and so forth and voter suppression, they're going to have millions and millions of people voting in, and we'll see who wins them. It's not, and I just think the Trump people would say, and they wouldn't be totally wrong, yes, at the national level, that's because of the Electoral College, and in the Senate, because of the overrepresentation of smaller states, it can be a minoritarian strategy. But it's not obvious that the Romney strategy was better to win Pennsylvania or Ohio or Wisconsin or Michigan than the Trump strategy. And in fact, Trump won those states and Romney didn't. So Trump lost them the second time, narrowly. Now, I do think, so I would just say, Trump and Trumpism need to be defeated. Authoritarians need to be defeated, both in primaries, along the way Will was suggesting, by bold entrepreneurs who are willing to step up, even if the odds are against them. And, again, a year from now could look very different. I do think it's not crazy to think Trump fades personally some. The Trumpist excitement, as it were, starts to hit against reality a little more obviously. Some of these people don't get rewarded for incredibly irresponsible and demagogic tweets or even positions on issues. And people, you can imagine a bit of a comeback to the middle, especially if there's some good alternatives. And then we'll have to see what happens in 2024. But I think there's a lot of public support out there for Trump and Trumpism, and we can then discuss why that is and so forth. But I wish it were, anyway, so I don't have an easy solution except to fight it. Honestly, both at the elite level and the candidate level, the donor level. But for me, I come back, I'll just say this one last thing. I come back to I think the way not to fight it is to accommodate the demagoguery, the nativism, the authoritarianism. And so far, Republican elites, with very few exceptions, in Congress, in the state houses, in the governors, in the donor world, have accommodated it. They've acquiesced, they don't love it, but maybe they give a little more. Maybe some of them will even support Liz Cheney against her challenger. So there's a little bit of, okay, I want to reward the one person with the courage to stand up. But you know what? They're also going to support Kevin McCarthy, and they're going to root for Republicans to win the House, and they will pay no price in 95% of Republican donor world, 95% of Republican operative world, 95% of distinguished Republican type world. They'll pay no price for purging Liz Cheney, for going along with Trump, for trekking to Mar-a-Lago, for catering to the election lies. In the Republican world or in conservative media world, we'll see if they pay a price among the general electorate in 2022.
We have a lot of questions right now. So
let me get a quick add on what Joe's saying. Look, Joe, I'm writing a book called American Reboot, and I reference the autopsy because we're doing the exact opposite of what the autopsy said. And you know this, you win elections by IDing your voters and turning them out. Okay. And I still believe, and based on my, what I've done on the ground and crisscrossing the country, way more unites us than divides us. It's just a matter of getting those people and turning them out. That takes resources, that takes infrastructure in order to do that. And the best way to do this is what Bill is saying. You got to fight. And if you win, then you change an era. It's going to be hard, right? And I don't think it's necessarily you fight a losing battle. It's winnable. You just got to have the right resources and be able to turn those people out.
Why don't we go ahead, and I'm going to take a couple of questions so that we can get through as many before we run out of time, which we're about to. So Leonard Levy, you're next.
Sure. This is for Bill Kristol. What is the reason for the enduring public support for Trump and Trumpism? Is it political? Is it economic? Is it sociological? Is it something else? What is it?
All right. Nice, simple question. And Rich, do you want to jump into?
Yeah, let me ask a quick question to you two, because you both have thought a lot about foreign policy and Republican foreign policy. And there's never obviously been one Republican foreign policy. There's schools of thought, there's the realists and the neocons and everything else. But there's a few themes that have been kind of consistent, at least over the past couple of decades, support for strong military, strong alliances, a belief in American exceptionalism and leadership, democracy, support for democracy, free trade, generally speaking, and things like that. Trump comes in and seems to have none of those, with the possible exception of a strong military. He thought allies take advantage of us, free trade bankrupts us, democracy abroad is not our business, America's not exceptional. It was unclear that many people in his own administration actually shared those views. But what's even unclear, at least to me, is what is Republican foreign policy now? Is there one? Or are there one or two kind of identifiable things? Or was this sort of idiosyncratic to Trump and sort of is the tail from him being in office?
Bill, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I'll be brief.
Answer that foreign policy one?
Brief on both, and I really would like to hear Will on foreign policy, especially. So on the first, obviously a ton of things happened to make Trump possible, and one shouldn't be over deterministic about this. History is contingent, and if Trump hadn't run in 2015, I'm not sure that they would have been an equivalent, and maybe we would have had a Rubio nomination, and he would have beaten or not beaten Hillary Clinton, and our politics would look different. It is an international phenomenon, the populist authoritarianism. So one assumes there are deeper things going on, a reaction to globalization, both economic and cultural. The nice way to say it about the Trump voters would be, dislocated, left behind, difficult economic circumstances, elites not explaining policies well, even when they work pretty well, I would argue, or when some of them didn't work very well, and not taking responsibility, justified resentments against elites. The not nice way of saying it is there's always been an element of nativism, racism, other xenophobia in America. In the Republican Party, it was usually 10 or 20%, kept at the margins, Buchananism. It got bigger, and Trump was an awfully good demagogue. And this is, if you look at human history, it's not like, these things kind of go suddenly from 10 or 20% to 30 or 40%, right? And it does depend on the demagogue, so to speak, not simply on underlying forces. On foreign policy, I don't know. Parties in opposition always don't usually have very clear foreign policies, and Trump certainly doesn't. The Republicans certainly don't now. I'd say a couple of things. I'd be more worried, not just about the Republican Party. How much is Trump's administration an aberration in American foreign policy? I had lunch with a European ambassador this week, and we're getting back to the lunches and so forth in person, very exciting. And he was he's friendly, of course, to the Biden administration. I'm sure he rooted for Biden. His country, his country is a very mainstream West European country. And kind of worried, worried about the alliance structures, worried about what happened to getting rid of some of the tariffs that Trump put on. China, I think I'm with the new American consensus, and I think Will is probably too, against the kind of 10 years ago excessive confidence and engagement and, and so forth. But he was worried that do they kind of have it under control? Do they kind of know what they're doing? They sort of want us to be on board, but then they cut us out of the deal with Australia and UK. And anyway, I'm not belaboring this, but I would say I'm more worried. I wish one could say it was an aberration for the Republican Party, but I also wish one could say that basically the ship is fine and there was this kind of weird 4 years. I would have said that. On November 3rd, I sort of thought, okay, we get through this, and we kind of get back to a responsible America at home and abroad. And I'm honestly just less confident about that today.
Will, do you want to go?
Sure. What is the Republican foreign policy? I don't know, to be honest, right? Like, I think it's, the one thing that there's two things that people agree. Support Israel as our most important ally in the Middle East, and that China is a threat. And I would say some would still say it's a frenemy, right? You got to deal with them and engage with them, but they should be engaging based on the rules of the road, right? If you're going to be part of WTO, you got to follow the rules of the WTO. But what should foreign policy be? Simple. Be nice with nice guys, tough with tough guys, right? And increase our allies and not decrease this, right? The only way that we're going to continue to have the American economy be the most important economy for the rest of this century is having a posse. And that means working closer with our allies. And look, we talk about authoritarians in the United States. In Central and Eastern Europe, you've seen, Freedom House, document how, the 17 years of decline of democracy in those areas, and that Last year was probably the worst decline. More countries slid towards authoritarianism than not. And so this broader problem is existing in Europe, and that's something that we're going to have to ultimately deal with as well. One tiny footnote, I know we want to get to quick, but I was very struck by this in the Czech version of Trump. I'm sure this is a wild, oversimplification, but what's his name? Babis lost Saturday, and a close election against an alliance that was formed to fight him, really, where they submerged all their differences, a little bit of a kind of never Trump equivalent, I suppose. And someone told the story, true story, talking to someone from the Czech Republic. And he said, well, are they going to accept the results? I mean, it's pretty close, and he controls the government, the strong man. And the guy from the Czech Republic said, yeah, but we're not America, which if we don't lead the forces of freedom, it's not like everyone else is going to be doing great if we go down this path, right?
Well, I think your point, Bill, is that we actually already have gone down this path. Let's get to final questions, I guess, and then we'll go back for a couple final answers. So Ginny Ramati.
Yeah, good. So I didn't want to end the hour without giving both Will and Bill a chance to talk about technology policy. And if you believed that if people really could have an honest discourse about these issues and these positions would then draw people more in to get more involved because they disagreed or agreed based on policy. So just in a kind of a lightning round sense, what would you each say about what you believe is the way forward on technology policy and regulation?
Well, thank you so much. And then Luis, we have you for a last question.
Yeah, it's a quick question. Is it safe to assume that Texas will turn Democratic in the next 10 years or so? And if that is the case, what is the impact on the minoritarian strategy of the Republican Party?
All right.
I mean, maybe I'll go and I'll leave the Texas to Will, and even the technology question to Will, because he's more knowledgeable than I am. I mean, I'll just say on technology, we need to have a grown-up discussion about regulation, about all kinds of policies having to do with social media and big tech and AI. And we're so far from being able to have any kind of, like serious policy conversation now in Washington that it's terrible. I mean, so you get half the people start screaming about Section 230 or something, and the other half say, well, we can't do that. They're right, I think. You can't just like make them liable for everything. And then, so let's not have a discussion at all. So maybe on the private sector, maybe in the equivalent of the Wilson Center and what Will's doing, we can have that discussion. People at Stanford, I mean, there are a lot of interesting stuff. You can read about it and participate in Zoom calls about, but I've got to say the level of debate and discussion about an important issue for us going into the future in Washington or among political figures or even their staffs is pretty pathetic. Final point, China, we mentioned before, I just want to emphasize, I do think in talking to people from abroad, maybe it's different, Canada and Mexico, since you guys are so much closer, they don't really understand, I think, how much American opinion, at least the political opinion, has changed on China, and that's bipartisan. I mean, if you had said a Democratic administration is going to come in and it's going to be more pro-Taiwan and visibly so, I'd say conspicuously sort of so, and not worry too much about offending the mainland an awful lot, that was going to be a Democratic administration, and they're just going to do it and think they're doing the right thing. And I'm personally sort of sympathetic, but it is risky, of course. And then they're not going to, be open to China in terms of trade. And then you get the sense of Xi really shutting down things in China and the business community being much less enamored than it was. I just think the China change is a big moment that people haven't assimilated and internalized. I don't know, again, what the full implications of that are, and I'm not sure we'll handle it well, but it feels to me more like a late 1940s, early 1950s moment vis-a-vis the Soviet Union of us with China, which is we're not going to presumably enter into another Cold War. Or maybe we will. You can't control these things. But we're entering a new moment in a very big and important relationship, which, again, the level of discussion in Washington is pretty pathetic. And therefore, I'm not sure how easy it's going to be to really get a good national consensus on it. I think it's possible because you do have less gap between the parties on that issue, I think. But have a serious policy as opposed to just kind of gestures and lashing out, I don't know.
All right, well, Will, you got 3 minutes to give us the future of politics in Texas and the future of how our democracy will handle technology. So
So Luis, what's predicated in your question is that with Texas being a majority minority state, is the increase in the Latino population going to change the tide of Texas? Most prognosticators have for the last 20 years been saying that's the case. Hasn't been reflected on the ground, because that presupposes that all, where the growth is coming is within the Latino population, that they're all going to vote for Democrats. So the key is you can't take advantage of those communities or not take advantage, ignore those communities. Why did Republicans do well along the border in 2020? Was because Democrats, they defund the police and the immigration policies impacted those communities. 40% of folks that live along the border have a family member involved in law enforcement. Another 40% have family members involved in the energy sector, and so you are impacting their way of life. So the policies are going to matter. But yes, demographic trends are changing. When it comes to technology policy, I agree with Bill. Most people, there's a bipartisan agreement about the threat of China. There's bipartisan agreement that something needs to be done about technology. But what we actually do is the sticky wicket, as we used to say in South Asia. And so for me, I think the most immediate thing that has to be addressed is Taiwan. And if a Cold War is going to go to a hot war, it's going to be over Taiwan. And right now we have to be working with our allies to make sure the Communist Party of China recognizes the juice won't be worth the squeeze if they try to go in. And ultimately, if the Chinese get control over 70% of semiconductor production in the world, what is that going to do to us? Right? If you think getting an iPhone 13 is hard now, wait for that situation and the inability to have those devices. But one of the things that we can be doing right now, and we can have all these crazy policy discussions, we need to be having kids in middle school be taught coding. I don't care what job you're going to have. You're going to have some experience. Just like my generation, if you didn't know how to type, you ain't getting a job. And so for the younger generation, we need to do that. And then we need to be making sure that we're upscaling current workers so that they can transition from blue and white to blue collar jobs to no collar jobs, right? And that's something that I think there can be a consensus around.
All right, well, here's to consensus. I want to thank you guys for a great conversation. I'm not sure I know what the future of the Republican Party is, but I feel confident and happy that smart people are thinking about it like you. And it really was a great conversation, great questions as well. So I want to thank Megan and Rich for inviting us all today, and especially thank Congressman Will Hurd and Bill Kristol for these great insights today. So.
Right. And thank you, Susan. And thanks everyone for joining for the last 3 days for our virtual regional meeting or acknowledgement of our meeting, and looking forward to seeing about 50 of us tomorrow in New York City for the first time face-to-face in 2 years, and hopefully seeing more of you in the near future. Thanks for this great discussion. A lot of food for thought, especially for those of us who have called themselves Republicans. Take care, everyone.